Welcome back. In this unit, we're going to talk about the relationship between thought and language. We'll first pay attention to the framework of knowledge and thinking and where language fits. These are the topics that we will go over. Here's a quick outline. Psycholinguistics is the study of how we acquire language and use language. Now, within this context, the person who produces language and the person who consumes language, the relationship between these two, it's important to understand. We need to know the speaker's perspective and listener's perspective. That's where we'll talk about the surface structures and deep structures in a second. We'll understand this better when we put this construct within the framework of thinking and knowledge, which we'll do in the next slide. Okay, so if you remember the thinking and knowledge framework, we said that thinking, if this is you, thinking is a process of making sense of new information by using your existing knowledge. In doing so, making sense of this new information will internalize this new information, changing the structure of your knowledge. So this is how dynamic we said that knowledge and thinking are. And we said within this context, then there is always some sort of new information that you consume for different purposes, but the basic purpose being to make sense of it. Now, what if that information comes from a speaker? And whenever a speaker utters something, that is linguistic utterance. With this utterance, the speaker is trying to convey some information that the speaker might have generated based on the knowledge structures. And that meaningful idea is the intended meaning. What he wants to convey, that is the deeper structure of the information. This deeper structure can be presented in multiple ways, but the underlying meaning of it is what the original intention of the speaker is. The speaker may use different ways, and that is the linguistic utterance. This is the utterance that is imply this particular meaning. Let's take an example. I want to convey the idea that I read a book called Thought and Knowledge, and it's wonderful. If I want to convey that idea, I can convey that idea in multiple ways. Basically, two ideas that I read a book and it's beautiful. That representation of the meaning is called the intended meaning or the deeper structure. I can say, I read a book and it's beautiful, or I can say, um, the book I read the other day is beautiful. You can say that I read a book the other day and the book is really beautiful, or book I have read the other day is beautiful. There are multiple ways of presenting this information. This is a very simple example. If you have complex ideas, utterances can take multiple ways. So the intended meaning is the deeper representation, and the way you convey it is a surface representation. The deeper meaning is related to the general knowledge of the speaker, and the words he uses, the means of communication. That's about the speaker. What about the listener? Linguistic utterance is the new information for the listener. The listener will try to make sense of the surface structure and try to understand the intended meaning of the surface structure by using the speaker's own knowledge. So the speaker, in order to make sense of what the listener, in order to make sense of what the speaker is saying, had to make an inference that, oh, this utterance means this thing. So the listener can make a right inference or a wrong inference, while the speakers implies this thing by using the surface structure. The listener uses the surface structure to infer what the speaker might be saying. So there is always this connection between what the speaker intends to say and what the listener infers. If these are same, then communication is good. If this is not same, that's where the issues related to communication come in. And you can see how this relates to the very process of thinking and the very process of using knowledge for different purposes. A speaker uses thinking to generate this new information and uses thinking to create a linguistic utterance. The listener uses thinking to make sense of this linguistic utterance based on the background knowledge of the listener and tries to guess what the speaker might be implying. So one way of thinking about it is a speaker implies when he speaks. A listener has to infer what the speaker is implying. There are terms for this: authorized and unauthorized inferences. If the inference that the listener makes are correct, then you call these authorized inferences. If you make a wrong inference about what the speaker might be implying, then you're making an unauthorized inference. Good communication is a situation where author's implications are accurately inferred by the speaker. And for that, both the speaker and listener need to follow some rules of communication. Surface structure has multiple meanings. It is important on the speaker's part to make sure that the words they use imply one, not multiple things, by clarifying what you intend to say. Ambiguity arises when the surface structure have multiple meanings. Let's say Matt inherited money. Bertha married Matt. If these are the only two sentences I give you, what kind of inference would you draw? Or do you draw any inference? You may draw inference that Bertha married Matt for money. But is that an authorized inference? Maybe the speaker is just presenting things in a non-conventional way. So it is important as a speaker, you're aware of kind of unauthorized inferences the listener might be making. At the same time, as a listener, you have to be aware of potential inferences and make right inference. Language can be viewed in multiple perspectives. One way of looking at it is the mode of communication. Define language as a way or a system of communication, a system that has symbols and rules of combining symbols. The idea of symbols is an important construct in cognitive psychology. Everything there is in the external world, either a concrete thing like pen or an abstract idea, let's say freedom, can be represented in our brain. The basic idea of cognitive psychology that we represent information in our minds. These representations are called symbols. If you take pen, for instance, this pen is the actual object in the real world. We're representing as pen. This sound pen is the representation of the object in the real world. Similarly, abstract ideas like freedom, that sound freedom represents whatever you are defining it as. Now, the idea here is that this connection between the object in the real world and its representation, the relationship is abstract or random. That's where the shared system comes in. So as long as the speaker and listener know what the symbol is, we can call a pen a cup and still be okay. I will add a video lecture related to basics of language about symbols and rules of combining symbols. Language can be seen as a way of communication, but language can also be viewed as a cognitive tool to think. Hold on to that idea. And another way of looking at language is how we think. And what I'm trying to say is that there is symbolic manipulation when you think. The use of analogies. There are different kinds of analogies like metaphors, similes. I'm going to call all these analogies in general. Analogies like metaphors or similes use old concept to understand a new concept, using an old concept to understand the new concept. Remember, we talked about how new information is understood within the context of the existing knowledge? That is the idea here. You're doing it by invoking some specific strategies, like analogies. So for similes, it is X is like Y. In metaphors, you actually directly use like a concrete thing to compare. Life is a journey, it's a metaphor. The purpose of using analogies is to describe the new information within the context of the existing information. For that to happen, you need to know the old information well enough and see similarities between the old and new information and try to describe this new information by using the terms specific to old information. For that, you need to make sure that the old and new information are related at a deeper level. You're not saying that new information is exactly the old information. What you're saying is the way the concepts in old information are related, such a relationship in new idea. Good analogy compares two ideas that share underlining meaning. For example, life is like a scavenger hunt. Life, scavenger hunt, one has two words, the other in a different context, doesn't make sense, right? But if you think about it, this analogy is basically saying that this is a new construct, right? And this scavenger hunt is like the old construct, and here you try to find hidden things. If you use this analogy to describe life, what you're saying is that life is finding things in life. That's a good analogy. Let's talk about a bad analogy. A bad analogy is where there is only superficial connection and no internal connection, meaning the way the concepts are organized in one concept and are not related to the other one. For example, comparing a boat to bowling ball strips. So rather than same alphabet, it's hard to make connections unless you stretch it too much, and that's where the analogy breaks. So it has to be simple and easy for the listener to see the connections. Another linguistic construct that you need to be aware of is categories and labels. A category, also called a concept, a concept is a category of things. For instance, when you say apple, not just an apple that you experienced this morning or an apple you experienced yesterday or all the apples you experienced in your life, but apple is this generalized knowledge. Remember, we talked about the generalized knowledge about different objects in the real world? So that is a concept. So you have a concept called apple. Everything you know about apple is stored in this concept in your semantic memory. Why do we have these concepts? Well, the reason is, remember, thinking to make sense of the new information by using the existing knowledge. This existing knowledge is a network of concepts. So the reason we have concepts or is it enhances our comprehension. When you look at new information, you're using your knowledge trying to say where this new object fit. It's called perception. You make sense of what it is at a basic level. And we do it on a moment to moment basis. Let's say you're walking, you encounter so many things, and these things need to be quickly identified for you to navigate through the environment. Having concepts to make sense of things quickly is natural to us. When you look at something, what you're doing is you're identifying this information as belonging to a concept. It's an apple. This is a book, or this is this. Now, same thing applies to language and the way we use language. If I give you some information, you're using the meaning conveyed in this information to belong to different categories. Remember, in the very first lecture, we talked about how our thinking processes are built through evolution to be quick and reliable. That's where you see some consistent errors in how we react. It is built to be quick for survival. But in our world, there is no need of survival in that sense of evolution. We need to understand things at a very different level. Although it is helping us for the most part, it hurts us in the because it it makes us it lets us not, it forces us to make decisions quickly based on the concepts you have. Do you know where I'm going with this? I'm talking about stereotyping. We have this general idea of, say, different races, different colors, and when you are communicating, because your system is built to be quick, we use categories. This is prototypical thinking. When you're thinking quickly without consciously being aware of it, you think through the lens of the concepts that you've created growing up. One example I give my students, the example of a schema. Schema is all concept, situational concept. Your knowledge about what happens in a specific situation. Remember the Applebee's restaurant versus McDonald's restaurant. So what I tell my students is just imagine you invited me to your wedding and you introduced me to your grandmother who's 80 years old. Just imagine I immediately touched her feet. How would you comprehend this? Take a moment and think, how would you comprehend this event? Well, you try to make sense of things based on the existing knowledge. According to the existing knowledge you have about what typically happens at weddings, this is totally unexpected. It's not a part of your schema at all. Then what you do, you force yourself to make sense of the new information in a way that fits your schema. So you may come up with inferences like, goodness, this is crazy. I shouldn't have called this guy. Oh, guy is crazy. You make all sorts of inferences that I'm pretty sure are unauthorized. That's not what I was implying when I touched your feet. In our schemas, when we meet our elders, the first thing we do is touch their feet for two reasons. Number one, to show respect. Number two, to seek their blessings. In fact, not doing so would be seen questionably. So, do you understand the point I'm trying to make here? We have these concepts for quicker processing, but these concepts will limit our thinking. What should you do then? Well, try to take a pause. before you make the inference. Develop your schema over time. Learn about other cultures, schemas related to others. A prototype is a typical example of a category or concept. If I say dog, the best example that comes to you depends on the specific experience you have. But different cultures will have different prototypes, typical examples. If I say vacation in one culture, it might mean different thing and evoke different images versus if I say vacation in some other culture. The concepts that are activated and the typical examples you have for each concept differs from culture to culture. When I say wedding, different examples come up in your mind as opposed to my mind. Prototypical thinking or thinking through typical examples changes from culture to culture. Prototypical thinking is automatic, system one thinking. What you have to do is to pause. That makes your thinking critical. But can we not make our critical thinking automatic? Yes, of course you can, but it'll take time where you have to deliberately expand your typical examples for each categories. Learn about particular ritual in other cultures. Try to meet people and get exposed to their cultures and have bigger frame. So when you see something's different, you have more schemas to connect it to. Again, the prototypical examples are different for different cultures. That is the idea. Critical thinking is not abandoning system one, just being aware of system one's prototypical thinking. We talked about psycholinguistics and we talked about how language is important and how to be aware of the constructs in language, implications, inferences. Now we will talk about the relationship between language and thinking in general. Is language a tool or does language dictate how we think? Is the relationship one way or both ways or what? We'll talk about whether language that we use can influence our thinking, determine our thinking, which has implications, which is implying that if you are a speaker of one language, the way you think is different from people who think in other languages. That has a major implication. The relationship between language and thought, is it deterministic or is it at the cultural level? Wolf was a linguist who proposed this idea that our thoughts, the way we think, is determined by the language we use. The basic idea is that different languages have different concepts. And because we think conceptually, and given different languages have different concepts, think is restricted concepts. So the idea he was proposing is that language determines your thought. You think differently if you think in one language because different languages have different number of concepts for each construct, but there is enough research to suggest that that's not the case. Language is seen to be influencing our thoughts, the way we use language, like labels, words. In that sense, language can affect our how we think about it, but it's not that we think differently if you're using one or the other language. The current perspective on the relationship between language and thought is that language and thought are connected and may influence one another. Language may influence thinking, but it cannot determine thinking, it doesn't determine thinking. In fact, the reason for language influencing, not determining thought, has to do with the culture, not language itself. Does it make sense? One example I would give is when I first came to the US, I heard in my grad school a lot of mom jokes. And my friend came to me one day and said, "Your mom is blah 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 because she blah blah blah." And it really hurt my feelings. I felt bad about it. And then I realized why when I gathered more information about it, although I still don't understand why only mother jokes are of that sort, dad jokes are of different kind. But the idea is that we don't have that in our culture. Mom jokes are not in our culture. Now, it's not because we are not using English, it's because it's not in the culture, we don't have this concept. So it's difficult for us to understand mom jokes. Does it make sense? It doesn't mean that I can't understand. I do understand what it is. So the idea is that language can influence your thought, but it cannot determine your thought. We'll talk about different ways people use language to manipulate us. So let's talk about the first. Semantic slanting is the use of words to sway attitudes. For example, pro-life, pro-choice, right? The words are used in a more positive fashion on either side to refer to their attitudes where they're focusing on one and negating on the other. So when you say pro-life, it doesn't mean that you're not pro-choice. When you're pro-choice, it's not that you're pro-life, but the way they are labeled tries to make people think that it is one or the other and emotionally connects them so that they will make decisions emotionally and not based on the actual philosophy behind the views. Equivocation. Equivocation is shifting meaning mid-discussion. You start a discussion assuming that we both have a common understanding of what we're talking about, right? Now, this is where the shared communication applies in terms of use of language. In the discussion, if I change the meaning of the word, it changes the dynamics of our discussion, right? That technique is called equivocating. We're shifting the meaning of a construct midway. That's why before you start a conversation, it is important that you both are on the same page in terms of what each word means and stick to that throughout the discussion. The other thing is about reification. Reification is the technique of um, treating abstract concepts as real, uh, and extending beyond that and make decisions based on how you are describing these. So I say my book is my knowledge. My knowledge is here. My knowledge is on the floor now. Making it a living being may end up in a wrong path in terms of the decisions you make. The other technique people use is bureaucraties, is overly formal language. Have you ever read a memo written by a lawyer? It has lots of jargon in it. Using polished, jargony language is not a representative of critical thinking. In fact, critical thinking is thinking in straightforward, simple terms, not complicating, but to simplify things. Framing, anchoring, and contrast effects all relate to the idea of how our comprehension of language is contextual. For instance, framing refers to the way you present information. Let's say the price of this new shirt is $49, or they say the sale price of the present this new shirt is $49. It was $99 before. The same price is presented in two different contexts. In other words, it's framed differently. So framing is the contextual effect of presenting. One example is framing. The other one is anchoring. Anchoring is when you're trying to make judgments about something you have very little information about, and an initial reference to that concept will determine your judgment. For instance, the book talks about an example where one group of participants have asked, is the average price of a new car higher or lower than $14,000? Then they are asked the average price of the car. Just imagine if the same question is asked to other group, but the numbers are different now, where they ask, what is the average price of the new car lower or higher than 44,000? The average prices these two groups provide would differ depending on whether they were anchored with one or the other question. That is the anchoring effect. The contrast effect is um, is in comparison to. So if someone asks like an open-ended question, okay, are you happy with your new job? Well, that's a very open-ended and a vague question. How do I report? Like, happier than my old one or happier than the one before it? On page 93, there is a very good example of a kid who writes a letter to her mom, and by the time the mother comes to the end of the letter, the context in which it is provided makes her feel okay that her kid failed the exam. Go ahead and read it. Coming to etymology and negation. Etymology is the study of the origins of meaning. Etymology fallacy is if you use the word based purely on the origin, not how it is supposed. So that's a fallacy, because a word may have origins in something, but it evolves. Language dynamic thing. There are some words that we don't use anymore, and the words we used before have changed their meaning now. Negation. A double negation, we all know that it complicates comprehension. But beyond that, negation also is a technique where you persuade people to believe something that's not true. For instance, if you say that person X is not a criminal, and if you repeat that information multiple times, what you're implying is the plausibility of him being a criminal. You are evoking the ideas in the listener. The use of negation, especially multiple times, may evoke the plausibility of what is being negated and may force the listener to make inferences. Remember the thinking knowledge framework, where we take new information and make sense of it, perceiving, comprehending it. That's a basic thing the brain does. One of the best strategies for comprehension is use some external organizational tools to help you with comprehension. If you're reading and you have an external tool like a concept map or notebook, you're creating representation of what you're learning. What it does is takes the load out of your working memory. You can rely on this new information that you have put together visually. There are many strategies. The basic idea is to have some external organization. Could be a tablet, a computer, iPad, or a paper. You use concept maps to visually represent externally what you've learned. If there is some sort of structure to it hierarchically that you're reading about, like birds, animals, vertebrates, you can use hierarchical structured concept maps. Networks is about how one concept is related to others, like the knowledge structure, how it is a network of interconnected concepts. And if there are multiple levels where the concepts are connected, you can use matrices or multidimensional matrices where it compares multiple things on some criteria. I would strongly suggest to review these from the signed book to enhance comprehension. You need to understand rules of clear communication, both as a speaker and a listener. Rule number one, tell the listener what you believe they want to hear. You just cannot say what you want to say, but you need to have an idea of what you think they want. That's rule number one. Rule number two, don't tell them what they already know. Otherwise, you are not engaging the listener. Rule number three, change the way you convey information depending on the listener. Think about it. If you're trying to explain a concept to a fifth grader, a college student, a graduate student versus a teacher would be totally different, right? because because the listener's knowledge, experience, age, all these determine what level of communication you need to adapt. So be flexible to restructure your surface structure depending on the background of the listener. Rule number four, very important, tell the truth. Now, these are the rules as a speaker you need to be aware of, and as a listener you need to pay attention to. But if these rules are broken, that's when communication happens. For instance, misinformation. You take the information assuming that the information is true, but the information that you received was intended with intention to change your behavior, then that is a disinformation. So tell the truth. Then use a simple and straightforward style of communication. Critical thinking is not about showing your verbal capacity to create complex sentences and using complex connectors. Critical thinking is about using simple language to convey ideas in a very simple fashion. Rule number six, use the context and the manner to clarify meaning, meaning try to make things clear. That's why elaborating what you've said is an important thing. Or if you don't understand what the other person is saying, you ask for elaboration and ask them, give more context. And you, as a speaker, use the context to provide meaning. Take home points. Much of our communication requires you to make inferences, both as a speaker in terms of deciding what and how to say based on the other person's knowledge and background. Also, as a listener, you have to interpret and make inference about what the author might be intending to say. And we also talked about how labels and categories influence our thought. We also talked about how words we use and framing can influence our responses. We talked about the rules for clear communication. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one.